So we were going through the different limudim and see how they combine. So yesterday we ended up with davar halamod b'gzer shava, something that was originated through a gzer shava. Mao shialamed b'vinyanav, can it be further exported using a binav? And on that the Gemara said teko. The Gemara didn't have a raya either way to that.
Did you say mem tes amid base?
Yeah, but I was mistaken. It's nun on base.
Oh, okay.
You don't want to chazer?
Okay. Next, davar halamed b'kavachomer. Ma'u sheyilmad behekesh. So if it started off with a kavachomer, can you then pass it on with a hekesh? Kavachomer. The answer to that question is a kavachomer. Umag gzer shava. Madach gzer shava. She'ena lemeda be'kesha. That you can't learn a gzer shava on the hekesh. Midir of Yochanan, from the halacha that Rabbi Yochanan taught us. Right? He said you can't use the gzer shava of kodesh kochim to teach Osham that it's mitzvah, because where does Chatas know it from? It knows it from a hekesh of oila, and therefore through a gzer shava of kodesh kochim, you can't export that to Osham. Nevertheless, so gzer shava she'ena lemeda be'kesha, a gzer shava that will not further export a hekesh. Nevertheless, melamed behekesh could be taught with a hekesh, midrav papa, because from a papa we saw that something that you learn lechatchila with a gzer shava, which is that shalomim can be brought with mois meiser. Using a gzer shava, we say hu adin atoida can be brought with mois meiser. So kavachomer halamed behekesh, a kavachomer which would be able to expand and teach from a hekesh. How do you know that? That you know we did Tana the Rabbi Shmuel, from the Tana the Rabbi Shmuel, who said that using a kavachomer, we can say that all of the karbanos of Yom Kippur have the same halacha as the other chatois hapnimiyos. Ein odin she'alamed behekesh, surely it should be able to teach with a hekesh. So we have a raya over here that davar halamed b'kavachomer. So you learn something with the kavachomer, you can further pass it on through a hekesh. We don't have an example of when this is done, and that's exactly why we needed to learn it out of kavachomers, right? This is all based on if you hold like Rav Papa, because we're using Rav Papa to say that it's melamed b'hekesh, something that starts off with gzer shava could be melamed b'hekesh. That's using Rav Papa's halacha. If you don't know like Rav Papa, and you hold that if there's any chulin involved, at all, and that's why we had to. That's why there Mar Zutra disagreed with Rav Papa. Michael Meimer, like the Mar Teku in Echanami. If you don't hold like Rav Papa, if you hold like Mar Zutra, we don't have a raya to this shaila either. Davar halamed b'kavachomer, something that you learn through a kavachomer. Mao sheyilmad b'gzer shava. Can you pass it on with a gzer shava? That's what I got my point to. He says, look, the Gemara, something that you learn with a kavachomer, can you continue that with a I lost the place. Right. So if you learned it from a kavachomer, can you teach that with the gzer shava? Zok Gemara, to answer that once again is a kavachomer. Umag gzer shava, madach gzer shava, she'ena lemeda be'kesha, that you can't teach it with a hekesh. You can't teach with a gzer shava what we learned with a hekesh. Midir Rabbi Yochanan, we learned that from Rabbi Yochanan. Nevertheless, melamed b'gzer shava. Nevertheless, it could be taught with a gzer shava. So one gzer shava could pass on another gzer shava. Midir Rami Bar Chama, like we learned Rami Bar Chama about the chalois of the Taida. Kavachomer hanilmed behekesh, a kavachomer which you could use on something that you learned from a hekesh. Midir Tana de Rabbi Shmuel. because that's exactly what the Tanakh Be'er B'Shmuel did to learn up about the Kabbalah Shem Kippur. Einay din shetilmat b'gzera shava. Surely it will be able to learn from gzera shava. So therefore, the Havar Lamed B'Kal V'Chaymer. If you learn something from a Kal V'Chomer, the Gemara says you'd be able to pass that on with the Gzer Shah. Okay, now we have another interesting one. If you learn A from B with the Kal V'Chomer, can you learn C from B with the Kal V'Chomer? So the Gemara Kal V'Chomer. We have a Kal V'Chomer for that as well. Uma Gzer Shava, Madach Gzer Shava, she'ena lameda. The hekesh. A gzer shava you can't learn from a hekesh. Midir Rabbi Yochanan, that's what Rabbi Yochanan taught us. Nevertheless, melamed b'kal v'chomer. What you learned with a hekesh, you could pass on with the kal v'chomer. Kida amorin, like we said. So ma gzer shava she'ein l'meida b'hekesh. Gzer shava that you can't place on the hekesh. Midir Rabbi Yochanan, that's what Rabbi Yochanan taught us. Melamed b'kal v'chomer. It could still pass on with the Kal V'Chomer Kidamar into a Gzer Shava. You can't make a Gzer Shava on the Hekesh, but you can make a Gzer Shava on the Kal V'Chomer Kidamar, like we just said earlier on to that. Kal V'Chomer Halamed Mehekesh, a Kal V'Chomer which you could make on the Hekesh. How do we know that? Surely it should be able to pass on what we learned by Kal V'Chomer. Zog to Gemara, V'zeu Kal V'Chomer ben Kal V'Chomer. This will be a Kal V'Chomer ben Kal V'Chomer. Why? Because we only know that you could make a Kal V'Chomer on a Kal V'Chomer from a Kal V'Chomer from another item that you also only know from a Kal V'Chomer. So it's a double Kal V'Chomer in order to justify a Kal V'Chomer on a Kal V'Chomer. Frag the Gemara, it's more than that. It's ben benoisha kal v'chomer, because you just proved a general point through a kal v'chomer ben kal v'chomer. You proved that you can make a kal v'chomer from a kal v'chomer, but now you're going to go make the kal v'chomer from a kal v'chomer. Let's say you want to learn some halach out of it, so that's another kal v'chomer. So you have one kal v'chomer that's relying on another two kal v'chomers. So kum t'chayis, such a kal v'chomer is really a triple kal v'chomer. So Zog to Gemara, Ben Benoisha Kal V'Chomer, and who said we can stretch it that far? Ella, we're going to bring a Kal V'Chomer not from something that we learned from a Kal V'Chomer, rather we'll just bring a single Kal V'Chomer. Ella Kal V'Chomer. Uma Hekesh, Shein Lamed Hekesh. We know you cannot learn with a Hekesh something that you only know it through a Hekesh, and we know that Imidirava, Imidiravina. Nevertheless, Nilmad B'Kal V'Chomer. Something that you learned with the Hekesh, you can teach with the Kal V'Chomer. We know that Midatana the very B'Shmuel. So Kal V'Chomer, Halamed Mehekesh, a Kal V'Chomer which you know you could learn from a Hekesh, Midatana the very B'Shmuel, from that same Tana the very B'Shmuel. Eino din she Halamed Kal V'Chomer. Surely it should be able to teach a Kal V'Chomer, and then it's only a double Kal V'Chomer. V'zel Kal V'Chomer ben Kal V'Chomer. So we know that you could package one Kal V'Chomer on top of the other. You can layer the Kal V'Chomers. Okay, now let's try another one. Davar alamed b'Kal V'Chomer ma'u she'yalamed b'binyinav. If you learn something through a Kal V'Chomer, can you then teach another item through a binyinav? Amar b'yirmei tashma. Let's see if we can bring a raya from an actual case. Now the halacha is, malika is the way you slaughter a bird when it comes to the Beis Hamikdash. If you try doing malika on a bird of chulin, that's nevela. The only way to be able to eat a bird is with shechita, like we do. We shech chickens. However, the halacha is the malika does still do something. Now we know the halacha is, what if an animal is a treifa? The difference between a treifa and a nevela is an animal that's killed not through a proper shechita. A treifa could have been killed with a proper shechita, but we find that it has certain sicknesses. The halacha is a nevela is tamei, but a treifa is not tamei, because the shechita is mataheres as a treifa mitamaz. So what would be the halacha by malik in such a case? Malak v'nimtzas treifa. So Rashi tells us that there's actually a three-way machlokes. One mandama holds that sai malika and sai shechita are moitzia midei tuma, if it's a treifa, and one man behold, Sai Malika and Sai Shchita are not Moitzir Midei Tumah, and there's a third man who says Shchita is Moitzir Midei Tumah, but Malika is not. So let's see what we have. We have two of the three Shitas over here. Rav Meir Aimer, Eina Matama Bebeis Abliyah. It will not be Tumah, will not create Tumah, even Malika. Now this Matama Bebeis Abliyah is a regular nevela. If you have a nevelas behema and you touch it, you're Tumah. If you carry it, you're Tumah, even though you didn't touch it. The nevelas oilas oif, if you touch it, you're not Tumah. If you carry it, you're not Tumah. It's only Matama you as you swallow it. So if you eat it and you swallow it, as it goes through your swallowing chamber, it's mitama you. So the tumah that it would normally have, if malika was made on it, it wouldn't have that tumah. Rabbi Yehuda says mitama bebeis abliya. It would be tumah. Malika will not be attire a treifa mitamas. Amar Meir kal v'chaymer. I have a kal v'chaymer. Uma nevelas behema. Madach nevelas behema. Shematama b'magu b'masa. It has a very severe tumah. So madach, the severe tumah of a behema, a nevelas behema. Nevertheless, shechitasa mitaheres treifasa mitamasa. Its shchita will be able to be mitar a treifa from tumah. Nevelas ha'oif, which even if it's tumah, is a shvacher type of tumah. She'ein mitama b'magu b'masa. Surely it should. So how do we know that shchita is mitayar by a knife? We know it with the kal v'chaymer. Now, how does it get spread to malika? Because Reb Meir says this halacha applies to malika as well. That's through a bidinav. So you see, you learned the main halacha from a kal v'chaymer. We learned that shchita za'if is mitayar asa midei nevela with the kal v'chaymer. Once we have the halacha of shchita mitaris oif from medina vela, we could further that with a binyanav to malika. So here you see something that you learned with the kal v'chomer you passed on with a binyanav. And mamatina b'shchita shemachsharesa b'achila, just like shchita is machsher b'achila, turning on to nun aleph mitaheres terefasa mitamasa. It will be mitar the treifa from tumah. Af malika, here's our binyanav, shemachsharta b'achila titar treifasa mitamas. Rabbi Yosy was the third shita. Daya kenivlas behema Torah sheshchitasa mitarasa v'loy malikasa. And Rabbi Yosy had the third shita that davka shchita will be mitar, not malika. But Rabbi Meir shita seems to rely on the binyanav that's used to extend a lima that we learned through a kal v'chaymer. You don't really have such a right. First of all, over there, if you learn the Gemara, it's really learned with a hekesh. The limud from malika to from shchita to malika is through a hekesh, not through a bidinav. That's number one. And to have it, and even if you want to say that it is a bidinav, he mishchita the chulin kaasyan. The raya is from shchita the chulin, and remember that's totally the machlokas Rav Papa and Mar Zutra. According to Rav Papa, if one of them is kachim and one of them is chulin, it still has the same rules. But according to Mar Zutra, if even one of the components, if the malamed is chulin, which is what we're starting from, a shchita of chulin, then it doesn't subscribe anyway to the halachas of einay loimed min aloimed, and therefore you can't bring a raya from a case where it does work, like over here, where we're talking about chulin. Okay, next halacha. Davar lomed v'binyanav ma'u she'lamed behekesh uv'gzer shava uv'kal v'chomer. So now something that originated through a binyanav, could it be passed on through a hekesh or through a gzer shava or through a kal v'chomer, or with a binyanav? So Zok Gemara, we don't have a raya to all of these cases. We don't have an answer. But pshoit mehachada. But we're going to try to at least see if we could bring a raya to one of these shaylas. And this is what the Brasha says. Mipnei omru olon badom kosher. Now, Rashi says we're referencing three words in the parsha of Oila, the Gemara Darshan. We had this before. Zois hiya Oila. And it's telling us that there's certain psulim that an Oila has, even though normally we say that even if apostle oila was placed up on the mizbeach. Im olu lo yerdu. But there's three flaws that if they occur in the carbon, they're so possible that even if olu yerdu. What are the three flaws? Zokt Rashi, prat l'nishchata b'layla. If the animal was shechted at night, that even in olu yerdu. V'shenishbach dama. If the blood was spilled out and the nerve was a zrika made, there in olu yerdu. And v'shiyotza dama chutz l'klayim. If the dam of the animal before the zrika went chutz l'klayim, so you can no longer make a zrika, those im olu yerdu. But all other psulim that could occur im olu lo yerdu. So the Gemara goes through, or the Brisa goes through different psulim and discusses why Rabbi Yehuda holds im olu lo yerdu. So zok the Gemara. Lon bedam kosher. Why do they say that if the dam was lon overnight, it's still going to be kosher to make this rika b'diavad that you should that im olu lo yerdu? Sharei lon be'imurin kosher. You know how we know it from a binyan because if a murin were left overnight, imurin have to be put onto the mizbeach before the end of the night. And the halach is, even if they were left and now they're possible lina, if you put them on the mizbeach, so dam should be no different. Binyan number one. Be'imurin kosher. You know why a murin are kosher? Meaning, if you put them on the mizbeach, you don't take them down. Doesn't literally mean they're kosher. It means olu lo yerdu. Sharei lon bebasar kosher. Because lon bebasar is kosher. Where do you find lon bebasar is kosher? You find it by a shlomim. A shlomim, even if the basar stayed overnight, it's still kosher. You know why? Because a shlomim you're allowed to eat for 2 days. So this is a binyan from a binyan. So here you have an example of a binyan from a binyan, and that concludes the raya that the Gemara was going to bring, shoyt me'achada, that you can make one binyan to continue the other binyan. Now the Gemara is just going off on a tangent to complete the brayso that we just quoted. Yosy. Why is it that Yosy, if the basar is Yosy, we said if the dam is Yosy, that im olu yerdu. But if the basar was Yosy, it doesn't say im olu yerdu, im olu yerdu, it's im olu lo yerdu. Why? Because hoyel the Yosy kosher b'bama. You find by a bama, there's no issue of it being confined to a certain area. So since you find such a concept, it's not so possible, and therefore im olu lo yerdu. What about if the meat became tameh? Again, im olu lo yerdu. Why? Sometimes it's even mutar lechatchila to do the avodah on karbanos that are tam. What about pigel? If you put pigel on the mizbeach, im olu lo yerdu. Because l'maisa it was a maratza in order for it to become pigel. Remember, you have to be able to finish the process of the carbon properly. Because there's a hekesh from chutz l'mkoymai to chutz l'zmanoi. And how about Shekiblu Psulin? If someone who was possible to make the Kabbalah Saddam did the Kabbalah Saddam, Vizarku Daman or Mitzrika, Vizark to Gemara, that's not by any puzzle, but any puzzle maybe in Olu Yerdu. We're only talking about Bahanach Psulin, the Chazul of the Sibur, for instance, someone who's only puzzle because he's Tamim. That Tumah would be allowed with Sibur. So if someone that was Tamim was Makabal the Dam, or did this Rika, even though it's a possible carbon, but im olu lo yerdu. Frank the Gemara, how could you say a murin that were long im olu lo yerdu because you learn it out of the basar shlomim, which lechatchila you're supposed to leave to the second day because you're supposed to eat a shlomim for 2 days. Frank the Gemara, what type of limit is that? V'chidanin davar shaloi b'achsherai midavar shabeh achsherai. Can you bring a rye from shlomim where that is this man achila to a murim where it's already past its best before date? That should also be kosher. Zakt Gemara, it's not stamas shushta. It's actually learning it from Diyuk the Torah. Tana azois Torah sa'ila riba samuchle. He's still relying on the zois Torah sa'ila, which in my mind only 3 and marba everything else. That's what he's signing on, and he just is giving a svara to compare it to the Basar Shlomim, but that's not the entire makar of Rabbi Yehuda's halacha. Okay, Gavaltik. We finished this sugya of the Zrika Saddam, Right? This whole sugya started because of this Rikas Adam that we said that this Rikas Adam of the Chatois Apnimiyos and all the other items that I learned from the Hekesh in the pasuk of Vasisa Labasar Kasher Vasisa Lapar Kasher Lapar, as an offshoot of that Hekesh that we learned to say that all of the Matonis Dam Ma'akiv, it led to this whole tangent of the different Lamudim. Now we're up to the next line of the Mishnah, which is Shayari Adam, the leftover dam after you finish making the Srika, you should pour on the side of the Mizbeach Achita. Al Yisod Ma'aravi Shal Mizbeach Achita says, Al Yisod Ma'aravi Shal Mizbeach Achita, and Yimlai Nasan La Yikri. Elu Velu and Shrafim Beis Adoshem. My time, what is the reason why you have to spritz the blood on the Yisod Ma'aravi? Omer Kra, because the pasuk says, where should you pour the dam? El Yisod Mizbeach Ha'ila, Asher Pesach Oil Moed. The Yisod that's by the entrance of the Oil Moed. Ahuda Pagabaresha. When you're walking out of the Heichal and you're walking straight for the Mizbeach, you're walking for the west side of the Mizbeach. So that's why we say it has to be on the Yisod Ma'arav. Zok to Gemara weiter. Tanu Rabbanan. El Yisod Mizbach Ha'ila V'lo Yisod Mizbach Ha'panim. Now the next sugya of the Gemara is going to be focusing on, by all the karbonos, the Torah lists off that you have to spritz the blood on the Yisod Mizbeach. The problem is we just had a hekesh to say that whatever halacha applies to one of these karbonos applies to the rest. Whatever applies to Parkei Mashiach applies to Parkei Dover, applies to the Parkei Kippur, the serum of the Nasi. They all have the same halacha. So why does it repeat everything so many times? So it says the Veskol Damapar Yishboich El Yisod Mizbach Ha'ila. Then it says by the Param of Tzibor Yishboich El Yisod Mizbach Ha'ila. And then it says by the I think by the Shernasi Yishboich El Yisod Mizbach Ha'ila. Why does the pasuk continue to repeat Yishboich El Yisod Mizbach Ha'ila? Why does it continue to repeat it over and over again when we have a hekesh that would tell us that whatever applies to one applies to the other? So we're dashing the three extra utterances in the pasuk of El Yisod Mizbach Ha'ila. So Zok to Gemara, Tanu Rabban, El Yisod Mizbach Ha'ila. This is the first one that we're dashing by Parkei and Mashiach. V'lo Yisod Mizbeach Ha'pnim. Don't pour the dam on the Yisod of the Mizbeach Ha'pnimi. I'm sorry? I guess on the inside of the door. El Yisod. I think you're asking a very important question. And I'll tell you why. Because they ask, the Gemara is going to ask, maybe you need it Lagufa. Maybe you just need to tell you that you pour it by the Yisod. So I think the Gemara says we would know that you pour it by the Yisod from a different place. Could be to what you're saying. But Dr. Gemara, Yisod Mizbach Ha'ila, what do we learn from there? V'lo Yisod Mizbech Ha'pnimi, not by the Yisod of the Mizbech Ha'pnimi. El Yisod Mizbech Ha'ila, which is by the next parsha by Helm Dover, that's to tell you that Ein Lo Yisod L'Pnimi Atzmei. That tells you another chiddush. You don't need it to tell you that you actually pour it on the Yisod Mizbech Hachitzoni, because we already know it from Parkei and Mashiach. So this is to tell you that when you build the Mizbech HaPnimi, it doesn't have a Yisod. It's just four walls. There's no Yisod. So it's telling you Allah on the construction of the Mizbech HaPnimi. The third time the Torah says Al Yisod Mizbech HaOila, which is referring to by Sir Nasi, there we learn, from that we learn Tein Yisod LeMizbech Shalayla, which means that all the karbonos that are brought on the Mizbeach, or Yisod Mizbeach, any carbon that's brought on the Mizbeach, you should pour it Shiraim Liyisod. Because, for instance, by the carbon oila, it doesn't say anything about Shvicha Shiraim Liyisod. So we learn from this pasuk that even the oila, you need Shvicha Shiraim Liyisod. There's a massive Tosfos on Amud Beis that takes up the whole blot, the whole Amud, that argues that Rashi brings other pshatim and says could be it's not only referring, it's not referring to all karbanos, could be it's only referring to oila, but to the whole discussion of what this halacha means. But with Rashi's pshat is we learn from here that all other kabbalas that you're makriv, the dam on the mizbeach, chitzoni, they all need shvichas shirayim liyasai. Frek the brisa on itself. Are you so sure that that's what you learn? Maybe ella mizbecha shal oila yehei liyasai. Maybe what we're learning is that the two matanos shein arba that you offer bar carbon oila, it has to be only by corners that have a yesod. So we know that there are two sides of the mizbeach that doesn't have a yesod. The eastern side and part of the southern side, but mainly the eastern side does not have a yesod. So if you need shtaim shein arba, and both those 2 points have to have a yesod, so then it's going to have to be the southwestern corner, because that's where there is a yesod. And it will have to be the northeastern corner, because that's where will be a yesod. Because if you try the southwestern corner, if you try the southeastern corner of the Mizbeach does not have a yesod. So maybe when it's telling you yesod Mizbeach Oila, maybe what the pasuk by Sir Avodah is telling you, not about the construction of the Mizbeach, but it's telling you when you do the zerika of the oila, pick the two karnos that have a yesod below it, which would mean the southwestern and the northeastern. Rabbi Shmuel, I don't need a pasuk to teach me which karnos you spritz the dam of the carbon oila on. Kavachimer, mashirayim she'ein mechaprim tunin yesod. These shirayim which are not mechaper, you do need to be poured on the yesod. Tchilas oila, the actual zrikas of the oila, shemechaperes, they are actually what creates the kapar of the carbon. Einoidin sheteuna yesod, surely they have to be on the yesod. So I don't need a pasuk to tell me where you spritz the dam of the oila. So al karchach, the pasuk is to tell me that every carbon that you spritz on the mizbeach oila, the shirayim should be poured to the yesod. Amar Rabbi Kiva, he has a different kavachimer to illustrate that the dam of an oila should only be spritzed where there's a yesod. Ma shirayim she'ein mechaperin ve'ein boin l'chapara tulin yesod, tchilas oila she'mechaperes ubal l'chapara ein edin she'tulin yesod. It almost seems like Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Shmuel are saying the exact same thing. The Gemara is going to ask on Nun Beis Amud Aleph, what is the difference? But since we're right here reading their words, let's look at their words themselves. Rabbi Shmuel just said, Ma shirayim she'ein mechaperin tulin yesod. Rabbi Kiva added more. She'ein mechaperin ve'ein boin l'kapara tulin yesod. Tchilas oila she'mechaperes ubal l'chapara ein edin she'tulin yesod. The question is, what if you didn't pour the dam on the yesod? Will it passel the carbon? So the Gemara is going to say, according to Rabbi Kiva, it will passel, and according to Rabbi Shmuel, it won't passel. Regardless, we know, independent of any pasuk, that the zrika that you make by a carbon oil has to be where there's a yesod. And therefore, when it says yesod mizbech oila, must be teaching us that all other karbonis that you're makrib on the mizbech chiton, you pour it down on the yesod. Well, that's going to be the shaila. It's definitely part of the void. The question is if it's makrib. And there's a whole bunch of shaylas of what it means. You need shirayim. Does it mean that you have to make sure to leave over some dam from this rikos? You should have. That's what the mitzvah is. I'm sorry, or it means only if you have. Is it makif? Is it not makif? Okay. So Dr. Gemara. And as we said earlier, 10 yesod the mizbeach shaloila, any carbon that's brought on the mizbeach oila, you pour the shirayim of the dam on the yesod. Now the Gemara is going to drill down into understanding this brayso a little bit better. Amar Mar el yesod mizbeach v'lo yesod mizbeach hapnim. Frag the Gemara, homi boilo the gufay. How can you make diyukim v'lo yesod mizbeach hapnimi? The pasuk is telling you that there is such a concept b'chalal of shvichas shirayim. Zok the Gemara, like Duvi said, Miyasher Pesach oil moed nafka. That we would know from Miyasher Pesach oil moed. I think that's what you asked earlier. But
You learned it from that, so then why?
you asked maybe we
We
need
already know it from our lives, and why do we bother another pasuk?
because we're trying to an extra pasuk to teach you that not all you asked from that you not only do you know you need to do shvicha shiraim, you also know where. That's what you asked. I hear. So Zok Gemara mibayle legufei, and for the Gemara that you know me'asher pesach al moed nafka. So let me see how Rashi says it. when we boil the gufay, sheyishavchem liyasoid mizbech achitain. You know it for the base halacha. We call shekain imrotza yitnim al pnimi, but maybe you should be able to put on the pnimi. So that answers your kasha. Yes, it says yisoid. It says that, but it's mashma that you could even, maybe you would learn Sham because you could even pour the shiori adam to the mizbech achitain, but maybe you could also pour it by the mizbech apnimi because that's where the zrika was made. The mehecha yalaf miuta. Why would you say that you couldn't pour it by the mizbech achitain, by mizbech apnimi? So that's why we say it says kasher pesach el moed. That's already telling you that you have to pour it by the chitzai, and therefore not by the pnimi. So the fact that it says al mizbech as well. Why is his name mizbech oil lamali? Lemiuta that you cannot pour it on the mizbech, a pnimi only on the mizbech. So if it just said shepesh oil moed, it's telling you that's where you spritz the shiraim, but maybe you should be able to spritz the shiraim inside as well. Kamash malom mizbech oil dafka there, and you cannot dump the shiraim in the heichal on the mizbech hapnim. Okay, el yisayda mizbech. What do we learn from there? Tein yisoid lemizbech shaloyla. So we're skipping to the third limud from the yisoid mizbech shaloyla that's mentioned by the seer Nosi. That's telling us that every single carbon that you spritz the dam on the mizbech chitzon, you also pour the shirayim liyisoid. The sol kedaitach kedichsiv, because if you're going to learn that it just means to pour it on the mizbeach. Dr. Gemara, Hani Lomali. Why do you need? There's a very much an Iker Chasam in the Sefer here. There's very much an Iker Chasam in the Sefer over here. But Hani Lomali means why does it need to say a mizbeach oil? So Nachmal, I'm reading from the Mesifta. The Sol Kedatach Kedichsiv. If you think it just means to teach you that you pour it at Shiraim Yisoid but a Nasi, and for some reason you wouldn't learn it from the Hekesh, why do you need El Yisoid Mizbach HaOila? What do you learn from that? You could have just said El Yisoid Mizbach. Why did I have to say Mizbach HaOila? There's a lot of extra words here. So Zak Gemara must be to tell you that all Karbonos you have to be Shayfet Shiraim on the Yisod of the Bech. If you're going to say l'shiraim, maybe the reason why it says is l'shiraim to teach you that you have to spritz the shiari dam of the sirnosity for the yisoid. That's bullshit. Shiraim habroi avidlahu. That makes sense because the shiraim, where do you spritz the dam of the sirnosi? On the mizbech achitza. So it would make sense if you spritz the dam on the mizbech achitain, the shiari dam you would also pour on the mizbech achitain. Why do I need mizbech oila to tell us dafka achitain? Logic would dictate that the shirayim of this zrika sadam should be on the mizbech achitain because the zrika sadam itself is on the mizbech achitain. Zok to Gemara b'royavidlu v'chi tema the avik mevach. But if you're going to tell me that who said maybe. The Torah says those karbanos that you're zorik the dam on the mizbech hapnimi, in order for the mizbech hachitoni to get its fair share of dam, those shirayim go to the mizbech hachitoni. But maybe the karbanos where you're zorik the dam on the mizbech hachitoni, maybe the shirayim for those has to go to pnimi. Maybe it's you're swapping it out. The apach mevach, and that's why I need a pasuk. The Baroy Lagavoy, with the Gavoy Labaroy, that doesn't make sense. You know why? Because Ha'ain Lo Yisoid Lepanimi Atzmai. We just learned from the previous limud, from the second case where it says Lo Yisoid Mizbach Ha'olah, that the Mizbech HaPnimi didn't have a Yisoid at all. So you can't suggest that by the Seir of the Nasi, where you did this Rik outside, that you would do this Shvicha Shiraim on the inside Yisoid. You know why? Because there is no inside Yisoid. So it's obvious where you're going to pour the shirayim of the sirnasi. So why did it say, you said mizbach ha'olah? It must be to tell us that all karbonos that you're makriv on the outside mizbeach, that you spritz the dam on the outside mizbeach, the shiori dam gets poured there as well. Or maybe Oy eino ella mizbeach shel oila lehei liyasayid. Or maybe it's going back to the original shiloh that we thought, that is to tell you that where do you make the zrika from the carbon oila on the mizbeach? Only where there's a yesod, again, which is the southwestern corner and the northeastern corner. Zog to Gemara, miksiv el yesod ha'oila. If it was said el yesod ha'oila, then it's maybe guiding you as to where you should do your zrikas. But it says el yesod mizbach ha'oila ksiv, which is extra. So the Gemara says the reason why it says mizbach is not necessarily to tell you what you want to learn. That is all karbonis. You have to spritz the shirayim or pour the shirayim on the yesod. Maybe it's also telling you Allah of zrika. If it just said el yesod mizbach el yesod ha'oila, you know what I would have thought? I would have thought that yes, I have to spritz on the southwest and northeast. But I would have thought, where on the Mizbeach do I spritz? If the Aksiv al Yisod Oila, Havamina Biskifa, I would have thought Biskif el Yisod, meaning, what does the Yisod look like? There's a vertical wall that goes up an Amma, and then there's a horizontal step that's an Amma, right? That's what the Yisod is. So you would have thought that the Zrikas and Amma of the Oila has to be on the vertical, on the lowest Amma of the Mizbeach, on that vertical section, which is the vertical section of the Yesod. That's where I would have thought it was. That's why I had to say, I said, Mizbach Oila. Hashid Tzchiv, I said, Mizbach Oila, it means Agagoi the Yesod. So once again, I don't have the extra El Yesod Mizbach Oila to tell you that all carbonas that you're makriv on the outside Mizbeach, you need to spritz the dam, you need to pour the extra dam on the Yesod. Maybe it's to tell you the Makam Ezrika. Amar B'Shmuel, Gag Yesod La Malikra. I don't need a pasuk to tell me that you have to spritz the blood not on the bottom vertical amma, but rather higher than that, because I have a kavachimer. Uma shiyare chatas, madich the shiyare dam from a carbon chatas. She'ena mechaperes. They're not mechaper anymore. The kabar comes through the zika. Nevertheless, to una gag, it has to be spritzed on the top of the mizbeach, on the top of the step of the bottom of that yesod, to nagag yesod, tchila soila. When you're spritzing the dam of the oil, the real zrika, shemichaperes, that's going to be the kapar of the carbon, einoidin shetu nagag yesod, and therefore I don't need a pasuk to tell me the makam zrika of the dam of the carbon oil. So if I'm mizbach, I see any carbon that you're in the spritz on the mizbech achitzain, the shiari dam have to be poured onto the yesod of the mizbech achitzain. And Rebbe Kiva had a kavachimer. Rebbe Kiva, uma shiari chatos shein mechaprin vein boy nechaper tu nagag yesod needs the flat step of the yesod. Tchilas olish mechaveres ubal lechaper enedin shetuna gag yesod. Mkein matam belomer yesod mizbech ha'oila to tell you 10 yesod lemizbeach shalayla.
The color between the God is better than the sun. Why are we doing that?
Well, the question is, first of all, on what point of the Gemara are you asking?
This color flamer, where the color flamer is assuming that the God is better than the side of the base, right?
Well, I guess if there's the fact that there's any requirement at all is a chumrah. You can't switch anywhere
where it isn't a copper, or isn't a copper using the God, and for sure that isn't a copper, you must use the God. You're assuming that the God is better than this.
I'm only assuming it's a better place is because there's some restriction. By the oil, there was no restriction. By the chatas, there would be a restriction. I don't know if that's pshat, but that's that. Otherwise, why should a gag be more chomer? I don't know. I think so. I think that's what it is, but I'm not 1,000% sure. Let's see what it says over here.
The God will fuki anyway.
The fuki lower, the fuki on the lowest. It means a gag and above. So I want to know, how do we know that by Achatos it has to be a God? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Okay, it says Al Yisoid HaMizbeach. And the Yisoid is mashma, the Yisoid Shehu HaMizbeach. It says Yisoid HaMizbeach means it has to
As
be the
opposed-
Yisoid that's like the Mizbeach. Just like the Mizbeach is a flat top. Yeah. Comparing it's comparing the Yisoid to the top surface of the Mizbeach means it has to be horizontally flat surface. Okay, Galactic.